Hello and welcome. I'm Heather Vacek, Dean of Faculty here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I'm here today with Edwin Driel, who is Associate Professor of Theology here at the Seminary. Edwin, it's good to talk to you this morning.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're going to talk today about Ascension Day. So what is Ascension Day? Ascension
Day is one of the four big feasts on the Christian calendar. So Christmas, Easter, Ascension, and Pentecost. It's the day when we celebrate that Jesus ascended into heaven. You know from the story that 40 days after Jesus' resurrection, he takes his disciples into the hillside and he blesses them, and then he goes up with the clouds into heaven. And so Ascension Day is the day when the church celebrates that. So 40 days after Easter, as the story says, and Pentecost is 50 days after Easter, so that always means the Thursday before the Sunday before Pentecost.
Nice. So you name this as one of the four major feasts. My hunch is this is the least celebrated of the four. So we don't really seem to celebrate Ascension Day.
That's right. In one of the theology courses here at the seminary, when we talk about Jesus' ascension in the context of his life and work, I always start asking the students, so how many of you are part of a congregation that celebrates Ascension? And of 30 students or so, it's usually one or two who are part of a congregation that does this, usually Roman Catholics. So Protestants don't seem to, it doesn't seem to function in their piety, in their church life. I also usually then follow up by asking, so when is Ascension Day? And it's maybe two more who know this. So this clearly indicates, right? I mean, you're right, that it doesn't function, doesn't shape our imagination. What is striking is that that's really different in the New Testament. First of all, the Ascension story, as you may know, it comes both at the end of the Gospel of Luke and at the beginning of the book of Acts, two books that Luke writes together as a two-volume part. It's really striking that he takes Ascension as the end and the beginning, means the linchpin around which the whole story goes. It's not a side track of the narrative, but for him it's a central moment. But similarly, if you read carefully through the New Testament and you analyze how often Ascension is being referenced, how often implicitly, it is actually referenced as many times as Jesus' resurrection. And so that tells us that for the first Christian community, this was not a minor event. This was big up there, and it shaped the way that they thought about the difference that Jesus makes.
So why do you think it is that we don't celebrate Ascension Day, except a small percentage of us? And what are we missing by not marking this moment in the liturgical year?
Right. Well, that's not easy. It's not easy to know. I think one reason is that, in a way, it's really hard to imagine what we're talking about here. Right? Jesus' resurrection is hard to imagine, but in Jesus' ascension, we're talking about the resurrected Jesus, bodily resurrected, who now bodily ascends into heaven. That means that we're making the claim that there is a body in heaven right now. I mean, that's a really, really weird, right? It's a startling claim. And so, in the context of everything else we believe about how the world fits together, I mean, how do you think about that? And I think that's one reason why we kind of have let that slip, because it's maybe too difficult to wrap our heads around.
One miracle too many.
One miracle too many, just too strange, too disconnected from other things we believe about the world. And, that's actually one of the things we talk about in the theology course. So if we believe this, and we believe also all the other things about how the world fits together, how do you bring those things together, right? I think another reason, though, is that I think many of us associate Jesus' ascension with Jesus' absence. Right? Jesus leaves his disciples. He goes away. Just a couple of weeks ago, I got a journal of one of our denominations, and in it was a meditation about Ascension, kind of setting up pastors on how to preach about this. And the upshot of the article was, well, Ascension means Jesus leaves us, and now it's up to us to pick up what Jesus has left. Jesus' task has ended, and now we have to continue the kind of things Jesus was doing. That doesn't seem like very good news. I mean, if Jesus leaves us and now it's up to us, I mean, that seems an enormous big task, and it doesn't seem something you may want to celebrate, right? That too, it's really interesting how for the New Testament, Jesus' ascension is not an expression of his absence. It's rather an expression of his presence. For the New Testament, Jesus' ascension, it's the moment when he goes up into heaven, and in the language of the scriptures, he's seated at the right hand of God. Now, the right hand of God, I mean, it's the biblical term for the place of power, right? Jesus is being enthroned. He receives all power in heaven and on earth. He is now ruling creation. The New Testament writers, they think here of the vision of Daniel. In Daniel 7, there is the vision of one like a son of man who goes up into the heavenly throne room. He is presented in front of the Ancient One, the God, and he is receiving all power over all of history. Now, that's what the Christian community believes that happens in Ascension. So for them, Jesus' resurrection is the moment when the promise of God's kingdom, of God reclaiming creation and transforming it and making it the way that God intended it to be, that has started. I mean, it is no longer just a promise. It's the grave of Jesus is the moment when that transformation, it has received a foothold in history. It is no longer just something of the future. It has begun. And Jesus is the first one to whom this happens. He is the first fruit, says Paul, right, of the great harvest. But then the ascension is that Jesus is now taking the helm of this kingdom. He is now leading it. He is now drawing creation to this final goal that has been inaugurated in his resurrection. And that is great news according to the first Christian community, right? I mean, one of the most striking images here, I think, is in the story of Jesus' ascension. When Jesus takes his disciples out into the hillside, the story at the end of Luke says that he blesses them, and while he blesses them, he goes up into heaven. So it's not, according to the story, Jesus blesses them, and that means now his work is over, and his blessing being done, he goes up into heaven. No, the ascension is folded into the blessing. It's part of the activity of blessing. While he's blessing them, you see him going. So the blessing is ongoing. And so I think this is exactly how they experience ascension, that Jesus continues to bless and continues to accompany his church as the ascended blessing one. And I think for us, in a time where so many Christian congregations, churches, they struggle about with the future, about what future they have, with the changing dynamics. Where all of us, I think, are looking kind of like what is happening in the world, and we see institutions crumbling, we see things that we trusted in disappearing, and we feel nervous about that. And in the context of that, the message of Jesus' ascension, that all those institutions may be disappearing, but Jesus is ruling. Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. I think that gives an enormous sense of confidence and trust and optimism about the future. And so I think that's what Ascension is really about.
Yeah, I mean, I hear an invitation to think about this as gift in a new way. So incarnation as for us, resurrection as for us. My hunch is most people don't think about ascension as for us.
Yes.
And I'm also struck by a kind of inherent tension. So you named, if Jesus is gone, it's all up to us, and who wants that responsibility? I wonder if there's also if Jesus is still in charge, then it's not up to us, and we might have to acknowledge that we're in fact not in control.
Yes.
A kind of worthy tension to struggle.
Yes, that's a challenge too, right?
Yeah. So given all of this, how might we mark Ascension Day?
Well, let me make a couple of suggestions. I would say, first of all, mark it. Right? I mean, as you noticed, we don't celebrate it. What if we would celebrate it? What if we would say, as congregations, we're actually coming together on this Thursday evening. We're having a service. Right? It would interrupt the rhythm of our normal lives. It would interrupt like the Thursday evening choir services and all that kind of thing. But that's exactly what Ascension is about. I mean, it's about life as normal is being interrupted. It is no longer the normal cycle of week after week, of year after year. Right? History is now really different. That is what Ascension is about. Jesus is in charge of history. So interrupt the rhythm of your lives and interrupt the rhythm of the congregational life, and maybe have a service that is not like others, but that focuses especially on the sense of worry and anxiety, and express that, voice it, name it, and name it then in the context of Jesus' Ascension. So I would say the first, maybe we have to go back to actually celebrating it. The second suggestion is maybe a little goofy one, but it is what we're doing here in chapel when we will be celebrating Ascension on Thursday. It comes from a suggestion of a retired colleague of you and I, Andrew Purvis. Andrew was very big on Ascension, and he mentions this several times in his books, right? And at some point he bemoans, why is it that we send Christmas cards, but we don't send Ascension Day cards? And so when people come here to the Ascension Day service in chapel, when you open the bulletin, you find in there a Ascension Day card. And you will be invited to send this to somebody who you think needs to be reminded of the message of Ascension. And so I think this is something congregations could do. They could make Ascension Day cards and send it out as a witness of, there is this strange thing we believe, but it's really important. And maybe one last suggestion, which has to do with how we take Ascension serious, not just on Ascension Day, but throughout the year. And this is maybe especially for pastors. Tom Long, who you know is one of the major homileticians, right? And here at the seminary we use his books on how to learn how to preach. He makes an observation somewhere. He says, we tend, in our preaching, we talk a lot about God, but the verbs we use for God tend to be in the past tense. We talk about all the great things that God has done, and then somehow we fit in there next what we are doing now in the context of these great things that God has done in the past. And what he asks preachers to do is to read critically through their own sermons and to underline the verbs that they're using for God and ask themselves, is that what I do? And is that, if I do that, is that true to what I actually believe about God? And so actually one of the exercises I have in my theology class is I ask students to listen to the sermons of the congregation of which they're part and go through this exercise. And right, the whole message of Ascension is that yes, God has done great things in the past. Jesus has done great things in the past. But that's only part of what Jesus is doing. Jesus' work is ongoing. Jesus' work isn't finished. Jesus is still leading creation to its final goal, and that is really good news. And so we are invited as preachers and as worship leaders and as people in the pew to live into that reality.
I'm looking forward to chapel next week.
Okay.
Well,
I'll see you there.
Yeah, Reverend Dr. Edwin Driel, thank you for time today, for the invitation to think more carefully about Ascension Day and to think about how we mark this during the year. And thanks to everyone for joining us.